Welcome to WITA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WITA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. Hello, and welcome to WITA's Exchange podcast. One WITA housekeeping note. With the government shutdown, we've decided to move our Trade and Tech Summit to December to accommodate many of our speakers and guests with the U.S. government. Please see the WITA website, www.wita.org, for more information. On this week's podcast, we're going back to the issue that at the heart of a lot of the current tensions about trade, the rise of China and its increasing assertiveness on the global economic front. Last week, just as countries were gearing up for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea, economic tensions between China and the United States and the world have once again escalated dramatically. To dig into these critical issues, we're bringing back three of our key experts to help us understand what's going on and where things may be headed with U.S.-China relations, ongoing negotiations with Korea and Taiwan, and much, much more. We're recording this week's episode on Friday, October 17th at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade issues we're discussing today may have changed. Welcome to the Exchange podcast to Wendy Cutler, Senior Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former Acting Deputy United States Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC Affairs. Chris Padilla, Senior Advisor at the Brunswick Group, former Vice President for Government and Regulatory Affairs at IBM, and the former Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. And our discussion leader today, Joe Damond, Chair of the International Trade Policy and Global Life Sciences Practice at Crowell Global Advisors, and the former acting assistant USTR for Asia and the Pacific, among other roles. Joe?
Okay, thank you, Ken. And hi, Wendy. Hi, Chris. Great to see you both. We've known each other all for a very long time. And so we're gathering at the exchange now, or maybe we can't say that, but we're having let's have an interesting discussion. Trade isn't always in the headlines. You know, it has been a lot this year. This past week, it came kind of roaring back because of actions that China took a little earlier in October, and then a very quick response from the Trump administration having to do with imposing regulations on the export of critical minerals that needed to get China's permission. Companies would have to get permission from the Chinese government to export products with these critical minerals in them, which was quite scary to some, and merited a response, an immediate response almost by President Trump, a very strong one, saying that he would apply 100% tariffs and may not meet with President Xi at the summits later this month. And the market's tanked. This is like the first big market tanking since the original big market tank in April. So people are paying attention to tariffs still. So it was a big week in that regard. What do we think happened? And was this a miscalculation? What's China? Let's start with what's China doing. Chris, what do you think?
Well, thanks, Joe, and good to be with you and Wendy. Well, the Chinese action on rare earths is pretty breathtaking. I mean, it is quite a significant potential restriction. It is, I think the reason that it has attracted so much attention is that the United States and really the world is heavily dependent on China for these rare earth exports, and many things require them, whether it's semiconductor manufacturing or consumer electronics equipment, or critically, defense technologies need these rare earths in order to be produced. And I think what got the attention of the world is the Chinese action for the first time didn't just say, well, we might cut off the exports or curtail the exports of rare earths. They've done that before. What this said was, we might require you to get the permission of the Chinese government to not only sell these things, but to sell things that contain rare earths in onward commerce, meaning that, if you have a semiconductor chip that contains a certain amount of rare earths, you cannot sell that semiconductor chip, say, between maybe Japan and the United States or Taiwan and Europe without the permission of the Chinese government. That's really unprecedented, and I think it's why it merited such a strong reaction from President Trump. What's fascinating about this is, and the question, of course, is why did they do it and why now? There are competing explanations. We're not really sure with anything the Chinese do. My view is what's notable about these controls is that they are almost directly parallel to U.S. export controls on AI chips and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. If you look at how these controls are laid out, it mirrors our controls in terms of structure, and even some of the language is quite similar to how we do it. So, for example, requiring a re-export license if something contains enough of this material, having a presumption of denial for military end uses. These are all terms and concepts lifted directly from U.S. export controls. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that's pretty clear, in my view, pretty clearly a signal that what the Chinese are looking for is leverage in advance of the Trump-Xi meeting at APEC later this month. And I think what they're signaling is they want to make a trade. They'll reduce their controls on rare earths if we will remove our comparable, parallel, in their view, controls on AI chips and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. In fact, they asked for that in the Madrid meeting with Secretary Besant and Ambassador Greer back in the summer. And they didn't get a positive response. Well, now I think what we're seeing is they're putting some teeth into that request.
Well, thanks for that, Chris. One thing that I noticed that sort of lends credibility to what you just said, obviously, is that the U.S. took some new actions pretty recently. In late September, putting new restrictions on affiliates of Chinese companies in the U.S. if you have over 50% ownership. And then early October, BIS added, I think, 19 additional Chinese entities, limiting their ability to receive U.S. technology. So it seemed that by one theory, that this was kind of tit for tat on their side, and coming so soon after these U.S. actions, and that they were getting concerned about the sort of escalation of U.S. action, not just what's been there for the last year or so, but that we seem to be escalating. Wendy, what do you think?
So a couple of thoughts here. My view is that, number one, the Chinese didn't write this regulation right after this affiliates law the new affiliates regulation came out. This was in their drawer, and the question was, when would they announce it? And they decided to do it now, in my view, not only to gain leverage at this meeting, but I also think that they think that they're in a much stronger position, that Trump wants this meeting a lot more than they do, and that, that they would probably get away with this. But I do think they overplayed their hand. Up until now, their responses have been largely proportional. And that was easier to measure when it was tariff for tariff. Now, when you get in the export control world, what does proportional really mean? And one of the things the Chinese are saying is it's a broad regulation, but we may green light some licenses. They're trying to walk back from this a little, just saying it looks really big, but in reality, we can implement it in a much more limited way. So, those thoughts, come to mind.
The argument from a Chinese, it's cold comfort, right, to hear China say, well, we have the discretion not to enforce this.
Absolutely. And I think from their perspective, that's how they see it. And I think here there's just a lot of miscommunication, a lot of mistrust. And we just don't see things the same way. I mean, the Chinese negotiators are also saying that they thought that, the U.S. had agreed to like a standstill on new export control regulations. So when they saw this affiliates regulation, which the U.S. viewed as a technical correction, they viewed this as like the U.S. going back on its word. So I'm not trying to justify or to rationalize China's response, but as a former negotiator, we've all been in that position trying to understand what's motivating the other side, how they see it, because that really helps come up, I would argue, with an off-ramp. And I hope that both sides can find one come 2 weeks in Korea.
Do you think that they seem... I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, I think to build on Wendy's point, that this shows the risk and the downside of bringing export controls into trade negotiations. And Wendy and I both commented back in the spring when it became clear that export controls were being traded off in the London negotiations in exchange for rare earths. And I think both of us said at the time, this is risky. It's unprecedented. Lots of things that this administration does are unprecedented, but it's risky. And I think we're seeing the risk now because it is, I agree with Wendy, it is disproportionate. If China had wanted to send a signal, they could have just stopped the rare earths again, like they did back in April.
Or just picked one more rare earth to add to the list. Right?
Exactly. But what they did this time was global, and it doesn't just affect the United States. It affects Europe and others, and it's causing quite a reaction among our allies.
And if I can just add, like all of a sudden we see Besson, talking about working with the G7 and recognizing the value of working with allies and partners now. So maybe this, in the longer term or the medium term, is even going to backfire more on China, because I think there's a newfound appreciation of not just the U.S. responding, but responding in concert with our partners.
I mean, even the president seemed to get that, because the Truth Social statement he made that talked about the 100% tariffs went out of its way to say this affects everybody. I mean, that's his way of saying and I interpreted that as his way of saying, okay, guys, like allies, wake up and pay attention to this. He didn't say work with me, but he did note that. So that was an important part of it. I wonder, in terms of the Chinese calculation, I don't remember the date, but it wasn't that long ago when the administration granted permission to NVIDIA to export some of its H20 chips to China. Do you think that emboldened the Chinese that basically they think, okay, Trump's going to be, as he often is, very transactional, that there is no bright line here on U.S. technology, and they Chris, okay, export controls are tradable now.
I think there's no doubt. So the H20 chips were restricted by the Commerce Department in April, and then it was in June, about 2 months later, that the president approved the export of those chips as well as some AMD chips in exchange for a promise of 15% of the China revenues of those companies. And I think the Chinese saw this. They also saw that there are senior advisors in the White House who work on AI policy who have said, we don't think export controls on AI work. They've heard, senior industry officials say AI export controls are harming our competitiveness or have been a failure, I think was one of the quotes. And so, they've seen this done before. There was basically a deal made on exporting the H20 chips. There was, as we were just talking about, the trading of export controls in the London meeting, where we relaxed some controls in exchange for the rare earths to be resumed. And so I think the Chinese calculus is, okay, they're willing to trade these things off. So what we really want is what we asked for in Madrid. We want no controls on AI chips, and we want to get the lithography equipment, which comes from Japan, Europe, and the United States. And I think they're making a bold gambit here to say, okay, here's the deal on the table. You get the rare earths, but only if you give us what we want on the chips. And I think they believe that the president might make that deal. And he might. We'll find out.
So I couldn't agree more, but I would just add one other thing to think about over the past week as well. Everyone was focused on Trump's threat of 100% additional tariffs, and I think, like as Joe said, yeah, the markets initially responded negatively, but I think as it played out, neither China nor the markets took that threat credibly. Because remember, the last time we really hiked the China tariffs, the markets tanked, and Trump had to walk back. But the other thing that the president threatened is basically stricter export restrictions, or maybe a curb on exports of, I think he called it critical software. No one's exactly sure what that means. Yeah. But I think we need to pay attention to that as well, because this seems to be kind of the first time where the president, who loves tariffs, either was probably convinced by his advisors, you need, sir, to put export controls on the table as well, because that's kind of where this battle is really being fought. And the credibility on tariff threats with China is becoming, I think, weaker and weaker.
Let me ask a technical question to both of you. Maybe neither one of us are experts, but chips are physical products. Critical minerals are physical products. Software is digital. So how do you prevent software from going from one place in the world to another? Or is that even something that can be done? Chris, can it be?
Yeah, it can be. We have lots of export controls on software, and American companies are familiar with dealing with that. I used to deal with it at IBM. I used to administer these controls, back in the early 2000s. It basically requires, American companies, or any Western company really that has software, to know their customer and to be careful, where they're transmitting their software. These are all digital transmissions now, but companies control those transmissions carefully because they're controlling the IP, and they want to make sure they get paid for when the software is downloaded and used.
They need to get BIS approval to do that, to sell to a particular vendor.
Yeah, in some cases you do.
Sure. Okay.
And one of the controls that was imposed back in the spring, purely for leverage reasons, and then removed when the rare earths were resumed, was controls on semiconductor design software.
Yeah.
Most of which comes from 3 large American software firms. So, I don't know what critical software means either. All we have to go on is the Truth Social post. So far, I haven't heard that any controls have been imposed.
No, but I think what it indicates is that somebody's looking into it, right? At least at BIS.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm sure BIS is looking into it. And, this just goes back to what we were all discussing earlier. The export controls, rightly or wrongly, have now become a central element in trade negotiations, particularly with China. And we worked for decades. I know this happened with Wendy. It certainly happened with me, where Chinese negotiators across the table, the first thing in their talking points was always, we could reduce the trade deficit if you just lift your export controls, right?
Yeah, but they didn't say it in one sentence. It kind of took 45 minutes.
Very true. With translation, add another 40 minutes. But and for decades, American negotiators, regardless of administration, said, no, that's separate. That's national security. We're not going to talk about that here. That changed in the spring, where very explicitly, you had Secretary Lutnick and Secretary Bessent both say, okay, we impose these controls. We'll remove ours if they remove theirs. And that opened, a new door. And now we're seeing the Chinese try to walk through it in a very big way.
This is something, I don't know if we want to make this digression now, but, the administration is actually tying trade negotiations to national security, political military issues. I mean, following Southeast Asia, that he's trying to use tariffs as leverage to get the Cambodians and the Thai to come together. There's been conflict out there between the two of them. So it's not just, this is new ground, I think, for trade negotiations, that you're trying, that you're doing this. And of course, the big, and we'll get to this too, is this is going to come up with China because Taiwan is right there, and there are certainly commercial issues, and in terms of Taiwan being impacted one way or the other by a deal with China. But and I don't know if either of you think this is credible, but there have been stories that Xi is going to ask for consideration from Trump on Taiwan security issues. And what do you think about that? Do you think that the Chinese, I'm not asking necessarily that we know what's in Xi's mind, but it's amazing, again, that he thinks that Trump might be malleable on some of these points, if those stories are true.
Wendy, what do you think?
Well, again, I think time will tell, but yeah, it's not just China. Other countries in Asia, and Japan and Korea as well, that are security allies with U.S. troops in those countries. They're very fearful that if they take Trump on trade, he's going to respond by taking measures in the military security area. Look, during my negotiating career, at the negotiating table, we kept those issues separate. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't know what was going on in the broader part of the relationship, or that at times when we wanted to be tough on Japan on trade, the security people would come in and say, enough, this is an ally, we can't go that far. So there's always been a connection. I don't want to sound like we were two different governments, but right now we seem to be headed towards a world where all of this stuff is getting kind of mixed up. And part of it, frankly, is for substantive reasons, because economic security matters are becoming more and more important, and economic security defines national security. But I think my only other comment here would be, I think this also raises a question about the durability of these agreements, because even if we reach them with countries, if the president seems to not like what's going on in a totally different area of the relationship, whether it be political, military, whatever, his response, as we've seen, may be to threaten or impose tariffs.
It's a tool for everything. I think it's a Swiss Army knife of foreign policy. Before we move off of China, there's a lot we could say more about China. I wanted to read a couple other things that occurred to me this week. First of all, we talked about maybe China a bit overplaying their hand, but it also seemed that Trump concluded or indicated that he had maybe overplayed his hand, because a couple of days after he announced the 100% tariff, he appeared to back off of them. So what do you think was going on in what caused that? Was it the markets? Was it response from China? What do you think's going on? All right, he doesn't want to totally screw up a possibility of a meeting with Xi later this year. Why did he do that? Because, as you said, maybe nobody was taking it that seriously either, even the Chinese. But he clearly felt, I thought, that maybe he'd gone too far and maybe something was in peril. And one thought I had on that, too, was maybe it's the farmers, because the soybean guys are really, they're hurting real bad. I guess there's been no sales of soybeans to China this year, or at least since Liberation Day. And they are screaming bloody murder, to be honest, that we have to come to some sort of understanding with China on these issues. And maybe he felt that, like, I can't go too far. I've got domestic constituencies now that have a stake in all of this. What do you think?
I think all of the above.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do think the administration and the president were caught off guard by this Chinese move. I think they were clearly surprised by it, and they were angry, because I think they felt that they were on a path toward, a summit meeting in Seoul that probably would have extended the tariff truce, which expires, remember, on November 10th. That maybe would have had some purchasing agreements on soybeans and airplanes, and maybe there would have been some progress on fentanyl. I think that's what they were hoping for, and then all of a sudden, this new thing gets dropped on the rare earths, and I think they were shocked. So that's part of the reaction. I think I'm going to remember. Not only did he threaten the tariffs, he said he was going to cancel the meeting, or he implied he would cancel the meeting. And then the markets tanked. And pretty quickly over the weekend, not only the president, but also Bessent, Hassett, and Greer were all out on the Sunday shows saying, we're going to work it out. Don't worry. And they continued that line on Monday. So I do think the meeting will probably go ahead. But what can we expect from it? Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe what we see is the tariff truce gets extended and everybody agrees to hold off for now on the new export control stuff. And that may be about it. I mean, maybe they'll get the soybean deal, but that probably is less likely today than it was a week ago, sad to say, for the farmers. So, it may just be that they meet and agree not to keep escalating, and then maybe set a path for a summit by a visit by the president to Beijing sometime next year.
Well,
I couldn't agree more. And I just would add, if you take a step back and you think of all the ministerial, engagement between Bessent and his team and the vice premier, and now we're looking at this Trump-Xi meeting, we're basically just like we're trying to just keep the status quo and not escalate. Yeah. So any objectives of trying to come up with a new trade deal and new rules or new commitments, I think that's going to just be very hard to do going forward, and that we're going to be in a world where just trying to keep these pieces together and not explode is going to be, the objective for these talks and for these meetings.
It's very odd in one way that when the president made his Liberation Day announcement, a lot of it was obviously very hinged on the U.S. trade deficit, and that is the kind of the North Star, I don't know if there's only one North Star for them, but a North Star for the administration. And the administration has been negotiating, and the center of that is China. And what the administration has spent the year doing is negotiating around the periphery. And everybody else is making these deals to open their markets. We'll see how durable they are. I think that's a good point. I think that Greer has been skillful in doing them, that these agreements are not made to last. I think they are short-run, under duress agreements. That's, again, my opinion as a negotiator. You over-negotiate these things, eventually the price will be paid. But anyway, they spent the year doing this, negotiating around the periphery, Southeast Asia, North Asia, Europe, etc., India, and have never even got really off first base with China. And we keep escalating and going back down to the base level of where we were. And I agree with you. I mean, this is, here we go again. We have this escalation, we come down. And when will they really get started? Is the question. Will it be next year? Well, is that what? And I thought, well, maybe Trump and Xi maybe that's the outcome. It's like, okay, now let's try to stabilize our relationship so that we can move on. But I think there's some I think the soybean thing is an immediate thing, and I think that an immediate issue. The administration has alternatives. It could try to bail out the soybean farmers again, but if I were the Chinese, and they're very smart, I'm sure that the price of what they're going to, of that concession has gone up, in part because the president has signaled how important it is politically, and they understand that. And what is the U.S. willing to give to get access to Chinese soybean markets? Do we have to lower our tariffs below the reciprocal rates? Do we have to get rid of the fentanyl tariffs? Whatever. It's hard seeing that it doesn't seem like the stars are aligning for that kind of agreement to happen at the APEC meeting this month. Do you think so?
If I could just add one more thing, keep in mind the phase one agreement, which was 90% Chinese concessions, maybe 10% U.S. concessions, but the U.S. so-called concessions were things we were doing anyway. We're now working with China, where it's tit for tat. Everything we want, they want to get paid. Every threat we make, they're going to make a counter threat. This is the new world.
I think that's one of the most notable things that we've seen that's different between this administration and the last. I mean, the Chinese strategy in the first Trump
administration and the last.
Yes,
okay.
It was in the first Trump administration, the Chinese strategy was basically to try to buy them off. We're going to write you a very big check, and that was the purchasing agreement. They clearly thought, over the last several years about a new strategy, and that new strategy is we have leverage, and we're going to use it. And they've discovered they have very effective leverage, whether it's on rare earths or soybean purchases. They've applied that leverage in a way that's been effective, I think relatively unemotional. And as Wendy said, tit for tat. Look at what happened last week and what happened in April. In April, remember, Besant and Greer had negotiated essentially a ceasefire agreement in Geneva. And then the Commerce Department did something that the Chinese didn't like on export controls a week or so later. And they cut off the rare earths and everything blew up, and they had to go negotiate another truce in London. Okay. What just happened again? Well, Besant and Greer had a deal or a negotiate. They thought they had a deal in Madrid that was going to lead to a summit meeting. Commerce Department does something. The Chinese go ballistic. We have rare earths cut off again or threatened to be cut off again. And now what can we hope for? Maybe is another truce in Seoul. None of this is representing any progress in terms of market access to China or reducing tariffs or solving the fentanyl problem. It's been since April really just a series of armistice agreements.
Things escalate and then there's a retreat. But just on this point too that you just raised, Chris, about the in both cases, Commerce Department decisions coming out at a, let's say, ill-timed fashion. Does that indicate a lack of coherence or coordination within the administration?
I don't know. It is quite remarkable. And the thing about both of these moves by the Commerce Department, and Wendy said this, I would characterize these as mostly either housekeeping or loophole closing. This 50% rule, for example.
Sure.
I tried to change that 20 years ago. Okay. It's a loophole. The idea that you should be able to keep selling to the subsidiary of a sanctioned entity doesn't really make much sense. If you're going to sanction a company, you should sanction all its subsidiaries at the same time, right? This is a loophole. It needed to be closed. But why now, right? Why do it a month before a summit? I don't know what the interagency coordination looks like. I would say, when you don't have much of a National Security Council or interagency process, my guess is that this is the risk of things that can happen where there are unintended consequences.
Accidental. More accidental than intentional.
That's a guess, but
yeah.
I don't know. I was amused, when Secretary Besant was accusing the Chinese negotiator of going rogue. My first reaction was to say, maybe the rogues, maybe they should look across the street rather than across the Pacific.
And by the way, as negotiators, let's talk about that for a second. The idea that a Chinese negotiator could go rogue and not there be any consequences isn't consistent with anything any of us have ever experienced. And that's probably it's not just China either, but it seems the idea that
did any of you ever see a Chinese negotiator go rogue in your time in government?
No, I didn't.
No, and let's just talk about this negotiator, Vice Minister Li Chenggang from MOFCOM. He has a long history of working with U.S. negotiators, and frankly, he was just China's WTO ambassador, so he's well respected and very experienced and skillful. And so, when of all people to quote unquote being accused of going rogue, I don't see that. This is clearly, in my view, a very he got orders from above, and he's fulfilling them. My other suspicion is, and I don't know, how accurate this is, but just from my experience, I think it's interesting that it was Besson criticizing him, a Treasury official criticizing a Trade Ministry official, and it wasn't Greer criticizing him. And that just leads me to think that maybe there's some interagency rivalry going on here, where Besson kind of wants to get the MOFCOM guys out of this negotiation and just deal with his finance counterparts, who maybe he feels are being more reasonable. But you know what? I may be reading way too much into this as well, because one thing I've learned, a lot of times these things are very simple why they happened. But I'll also say that I've been in that hot seat. I have been accused during my career, both publicly and privately, of being a horrible negotiator, of being unnecessarily mean, of not representing my country's interests. And the response always has been that my bosses and colleagues back me up 100%, and that my role in the negotiations almost even strengthened, right? And so I just think this is a not a great strategy and something, or not a great tactic, and frankly may just embolden or strengthen Vice Minister Lee's role in these negotiations.
I would say that the culture, particularly USTR, Chris, you can speak for commerce, I'm sure it's similar, has always been to close ranks if your negotiator is being criticized, and you could always count on that support. And whether or not you necessarily even agree with that as a senior official, you stand by them, because they need that to be credible negotiators. It would be mere speculation to ask if that's still the case at the U.S. government agencies. So we should go there. Why don't we move to, we have a few minutes left, but one thing we haven't talked about is that there are some big meetings coming up. We've touched on it a little bit. There are some big meetings coming up at the end of this month. There's the ASEAN leaders meeting, which is the last week of October, followed by the APEC leaders meeting on Halloween, or maybe that's apt, and November 1st in Korea. And there's trade activity going on around the market. I mean, I think the Trump-Xi meeting is probably the big show. That's what the media is going to focus on, justifiably for a lot of reasons. But there's a lot of other trade activity going on. The administration is negotiating. There are, at the very least, 8 ASEAN countries who are engaged in bilateral or reciprocal trade negotiations with the U.S. It seems pretty clear that the administration, and Greer has said this, that the administration would like to conclude a few of them at the APEC meetings or at ASEAN meetings or later this month. Raises the question of why. Obviously, he wants to get some of these things done. They haven't been concluded yet, so time is starting to get short on these things. I've heard a few things about why that might be. And then, Wendy, I want to maybe start, though, by asking you about another situation, which is that the APEC leaders meeting is going to be in Korea. And Korea is another country that has not concluded, a very important trading partner, very important security partner in Asia, that has not concluded an agreement. It looks like it's been close. And there have been some positive announcements, but the documents have not been signed. So and I think a lot of it has to do with this fund, this investment fund and how that's going to work. But what's your take on it?
So my take is there's just a big push by both sides to try and finalize that deal by the time of the APEC meeting. And there are a lot of meetings going on at very senior levels between the trade ministers and the finance ministers. But you're correct that the big hangup is the investment fund. Korea reading the MOU. Japan's MOU on the investment fund led the president of Korea to say, I would be impeached if I agreed to this. So there's a negotiation underway to try and see if that fund can be shaped in a way that would make it more acceptable to Korea. But unclear if that can happen. I think there, again, is a real push and desire to make it happen. And, if you just take a step back, if indeed the Xi-Trump meeting is not as successful as folks had expected or hoped just a week, 2 weeks ago, then I think the pressure on the administration to actually sign deals, whether it be with Malaysia, Indonesia, Cambodia, or Korea, or even to show major progress with India, which we're also seeing, I think that pressure becomes greater, that, those would be the deliverables coming out of this trip versus kind of resetting and energizing the U.S.-China relationship.
You need to show, there's a great need to show some momentum.
Absolutely.
On the agenda. And if it's stalled with China, then at least you have these other things. Do you think there's any connection? So maybe I'm reading too much into this. If the administration's desire, maybe it's just momentum, but the desire to get some of these agreements locked down before the IEPA decision, you think there's any connection between that? I mean, I as a trade wonk, I thought, well, okay, you get an agreement. Let's say the administration loses on IEPA, but now you've got a trade agreement. So you could use Section 301 to say if a country backs off from commitments it's made, it's a violation of a trade agreement. And, you can, and you've made a commitment to the U.S., you can say, so let's, and certainly after the decision, countries may have greater leverage not to conclude such agreements. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but or if it's just a question of, look, we got to get some of these deals done, regardless of what the court case is.
That would be thinking 4 steps ahead, which I haven't seen happen that much in recently. I mean, it's a good point, Joe. It makes sense to try to lock those down before the IEPA decision, although that may not come until next year. Who knows what the court's timeline will be. But I do think, I mean, from talking to people in the business community, I'm sure both of you do as well, it's nice to do Cambodia. That's important, I think, particularly for the apparel industry, Malaysia and so forth. I think what most businesses are looking at is Korea and India. The Korea deal, which was announced and the terms are out there, really needs to get locked down. And then we really need to see progress on India. I mean, if you had told me in January that in October we would be having 50% tariffs on India and heading toward some sort of a summit with China, I would have said, no, you've mixed the countries up. It's going to be the other way around, right? I mean, the notion that we're still having these huge tariffs on India while trying to do a deal with China, and we've shown some forbearance on China. We haven't hit them with tariffs on their Russian oil purchases. I mean, it's kind of backwards. And I think, for many businesses, there needs to be progress on India. And so if
we're seeing some progress, though.
I hope so. I mean, it seems like it, although there's some question as to whether there was a phone call and what was discussed in the phone call between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. But I think both sides want to see some progress, and we need to. So if over the next few weeks, we get a meeting with Xi that's a stalemate or a continuation of the ceasefire, and they can lock down Korea and some progress on India, I think that would be a good result. And then the other stuff is icing on the cake.
Chris, I think we have to leave it. Wendy, I think we'll have to leave it at that. We have about timed out. It's been a great discussion. We could obviously go on. There's a lot more to talk about, and there will be even more to talk about after these summits take place later this month. Thanks a lot for all the insight. It's been a great discussion. This is Joe Damond. Thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next week on WITA's Friday Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WITA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WITA's Friday Exchange.